Thank you, Lesego, for that warm introduction. Thank you very much. Good evening, guys. It's a pleasure to be with you today and to share with you some of my experiences over the last 20 plus years. Um, Let me just get my screen share up and running. And if you can just give me confirmation that you can see my screen, we'll be ready to kick off.
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect, thank you. I'll just stop my video at this point and with the presentation. As Lesego was introduced by the introduction, I am just over 20 years in the IT industry. I started at one of the parastatals in the year 1999 at Sportnet as a developer. And over the years, I went from a developer to tech lead, and then ultimately into a software solution architect role, as well as becoming a freelance consultant. My journey has been very typical of the technical side of development in this country, and that I've gone the route of the techie with some management. Then towards the start of the pandemic last year, I I branched off into my own and I started a company called African Digital with a focus on taking some of the skills that I've learned over the last 20 odd years and bringing that into the SME market and availing some of the skills and technologies and insights that we often see in corporates and big companies, multinationals, that is not necessarily available to the smaller guys, and bring that into the market and assist these guys to achieve similar competitive advantages that we see our bigger companies have in this country. So I'm very passionate about people and I'm a passionate technologist, but my passion for people and seeing the growth of people and industry and specifically in the SME market is what ultimately drives my day to day. For me, really, I think technology is a game changer. I think South Africa specifically is lagging in implementation and innovation when it comes to the technology space, but I don't think that we have a lack of the necessary skill sets. I don't think it's a lack of having the right people. I think we are just lagging, and I want to, as part of my impactful work as a consultant and a freelance consultant, is to bring that change and then to accelerate some of the technology changes that I have encountered in the rest of the globe. In my work as a consultant, I've worked for a multinational consulting firm and have traveled the world. I've seen changes across the globe, especially in the East, where technology is embraced um, comparatively to our counterparts in Europe and the US. I think as South Africans, there's a lot for us to learn, not just on the rest in the rest of the world, but specifically on this continent where we see our friends, colleagues in in Africa, especially Nigeria and Kenya, doing amazing work in the technology space. And I think we are slowly lagging, but I think we have the right skills to really bring change in this industry and get us back where we were about 15 to 10 years ago. I think we've sort of lost our place as one of the leaders when it comes to technology and having been overtaken by the likes of Nigeria and Kenya. And just the enthusiasm with which the rest of this continent has taken up technology and innovation. Things like blockchain being implemented in Ethiopia as part of a government program. So sort of leads us to believe that our government needs to step up, but not just the government, we as individuals and private business need to step up and just drive it from our side and making sure that what we implement here is on par with the rest of the world. As I say, from a technology perspective and a skills perspective, we definitely have the right people, we have the right skills and at the required level to make change. It is just a case of putting our backs to the wheel and getting it to turn and getting it done. So tonight, really, I just want to give a real overview of what architecture is, the way I see the role of the architect, where they sit, what it means for a organization, whether it is a corporate or a smaller startup, and if we can see architects playing a positive role in industry, and from a sort of BA and IIBA perspective, what does that mean for the BA role, and how do we get us to engage as colleagues across the board to produce and ultimately present software systems, processes that are of the benefit, not just to the companies that we work in, but to society as a whole, and have impactful changes in society. That's a little bit about me. So I think we are ready to kick off. And this is my theme for the day. This might be a surprising statement to say that architects must fall. In this country, we're all aware of things like fees must fall and the likes. And for me, architects must fall really might sound as a surprising thing to people, seeing that I claim to be an architect and that I work in that space. But we will unpack the statement, we will work through it, and hopefully by the end of the presentation and the question and answer session, that we can have insight into the statement and what is meant by it, and how I see it as a not so controversial statement, but something that is really needed. So let's kick off and just start off with a very basic thing and look at what is the definition of an architect and what really it means. And the word architect comes from the Greek word architecton, or if you look at the Latin phrase, it's architectos. And archi means chief or master, and the tecton or the tectus part of the word refers to the director of the works. So back in the day, the architect was typically a master mason or stonemason or master builder, and this is where the term architect come from. And you often see when people talk about architects that they reference the building industry and throwing up of plans. I personally don't like that analogy, and hopefully I can enlighten you about why I don't like it. But it is something that has sort of taken place and shape in the industry, and people often use it to describe what software architects do. Then, just from a system and software perspective and the IT perspective, architecture is really one of two ways that we can use it. One is the noun, which describes the patterns and the dynamic themes that we at a large scale design for our organizations. So often we talk about the architecture or the intended architecture versus the actual architecture, or we often use it as a verb and where we talk about the function of the architect, where they will be architecting or drawing up designs. So this is not a once-off exercise. It's something that happens continuously, and for the modern organization, more so with our agile ways of working, that it is often changed, it evolves over time, and it is something that happens more often. It's not back in the old days where it was a waterfall approach, where the architect goes away for a couple of months, comes up with a blueprint, and then takes it to the developers and hands it off, and hopefully they'll implement it. So that is what, from a very high level, what an architect and architecture stands for. And if we then move into what we look at, the different taxonomies of architecture, we have different types of architectural domains, and we'll just quickly go through them. We'll start at the very low level of the application architect or application architecture. And this is representative of, a specific application or system, and the architecture that is a structural design, including the business logic, the user experience, and data, and is generally given to a application architect, which is very much a detailed orientated role. very much closely working with the development teams to deliver a single specific application or system. The next one, and I think this one is particularly interesting because it speaks to sort of the path that you as BAs generally tend to take when you look at architecture. It is the business architect. And this is a role that really looks at the multidimensional views of the business. What are the capabilities of the business? What end-to-end value does the business deliver to its clients or end users, depending on the type of organization? It looks at organizational structure and restructuring. It looks at business processes and even includes things like, strategic initiatives and stakeholder management, uh, business policy initiatives, and ultimately product development. The third one really is around the data architect, and this is how do we use the data and data management, data governance to align with the business architecture and strategy. And often this architecture role stems from someone that has a background in database administration and they work their way through it. The fourth one really is the technical architect, and this is when we talk about infrastructure, how our infrastructure connected and supporting our data architecture, our application architecture, our business architecture and strategy. And this is, the guys that we generally see as our techies, but they do have a role in the broader enterprise, and we can see them move up the ladder in the corporate to a more senior role as a technical architect. The first one on this slide really speaks to the enterprise architect. An enterprise architect really is someone that plays a very important role, that they straddle the, the divide between architecture and business, as well as architecture and the C-suite. So at this level, what our architects generally look at is they look at the analysis, design, and implementation and development of strategy as per everything else, but they also need to take into account how the organization strategy planning for the next couple of years fit in. What are the direct competitors? Who are the direct competitors? What are they looking for? How do they engage with their clients and end users? So it's a much more holistic thing, and it takes a little bit of the technical stuff and marries it with the more business minded. So when you get to the enterprise architecture level, we move to a state where it is both a technical role, but it also need to be a executive role. And these guys generally report directly to a CIO or CTO, depending on the structure of the particular organization. So this is what I really find very difficult when dealing with architects. And having come through the ranks as such, it is something that we all experienced. Less so, I think, you guys from a BA perspective, but I'm sure that you have engaged with developers that often refer to the architects. So the first flaw, or the first type of architect that we don't want to be, is what we would call an ivory tower architect. These are the guys that sit on the 10th floor, the 7th floor, the 20th floor, depending on the size of the building. And you always hear the developers talking about they need to go see the architects. You never actually see the architects come down and visit the developers or the various development teams. And they preach the architecture from this ivory tower. They don't come down to the teams have to come up to them and ask permission to use certain things, which is often denied. The next one is what I refer to as captain architect, which is really like a policeman type of architect. And he's the guy that uses the architectural documents to deny people to do anything. When it's a new piece of software that they want to try out, if it's a new library, a new approach, a new tech stack, a new way of doing business. If it's a business architect, these guys would use existing architecture to deny anyone from doing anything instead of doing a supporting and guiding role. The third flaw that I've seen in architects is the one which is here labeled the great creator. These are the type of guys that go away and they create this fantastic piece of architecture with long-term plans, and they come up with a design that takes in all the consideration, but it's very idealistic. It has no basis in reality. It is assumption about the perfect system in the perfect world that we live in. And they are so far removed from reality that whatever they produce, even though it's such a great document, could never really be implemented in the real world, especially in their own context. Then if we look at the abstractionist type of architect, it's a person that they tend to oversimplify things. So this is generally in a response to a manager or a group of developers saying that the architecture is too complicated, and they oversimplify it. But in doing so, the oversimplification then removes any insight into the architecture and why the architecture is really needed and chosen to be in that specific way. Then we have someone that, if you ever come across these people, they are the most brilliant um, talkers and presenters, and those are PowerPoint architects, and they tend to document a lot of their works using presentations, and they're great at doing presentations. The problem with PowerPoint architects are that because they're not using any of the traditional methods to just to version control and management, and everything is in a presentation, it's often difficult to follow changes in architecture because you need to remember which presentation contained which piece of architectural decision and what it meant and what's the impact on anything else. The spiderweb designer really is someone that creates those very complex, I'm sure you've seen in the companies that you may have worked in or have worked with, that you have these complicated designs and architectural UML documents that spans multiple A0 pages. And when you speak to these type of architects, the first thing that they normally tell you is that it is a complicated system. So they overcomplicate things as opposed to what the abstractionist type of architect does, which is oversimplifies. And last but not least of these flaws that I find is the architect that seeks perfection. The problem with perfection is that they only feel comfortable to share the architectural decisions and designs once it's completely done, and that they are 100% happy with it. And unfortunately, in this day and age, with constant change and agile ways of work, what this means is that they will never have a completed architectural document. But those are the 7 flaws. And conversely, I've also come and talked about the 7 habits of highly effective architects. The first one for me is one of the most important things, and it's a principle that I live by. As an architect, you need to eat your own dog food. So if you as an architect develop a piece of work or a piece of code, you need to test it. You need to make sure that you can use it in a scenario that a developer would. You can't just hand over something untested that you have no idea whether it will work in a real world scenario because the POC looks like it ticks all the checkboxes. The second one really, for me, as important, as an architect, you're not above the law. You are not exempt from the standards. Whatever standards are applied to everyone else is applicable to you. It is highly hypocritical of an architect to enforce standards when they themselves don't live by the standards. So it's one of those things that I live by, and I truly believe that as architects, we set examples and we live by the same set of rules and regulations and standards as everyone else. The third habit for me is we are teachers, not preachers. We are here to share our experiences and our knowledge to teach and mentor our development teams. We do not preach, we teach. We cannot preach and shout from our towers. We cannot scold our developers without telling them and guiding them and advising them what they've done wrong. We are here to help them produce the best that they can. For me, the next one under documentation, really, it is as much as we expect our BAs, our developers, our testers to document and do great documentation work, so too this applies to us. We need to document our decisions. We need to document our architectures properly. Any decision that has been made, any assumptions need to follow the same stringent documentation rules as everyone else. Then we also need to look at when we do work, we cannot lead from above. Leaders, and especially architects, need to be part of teams. There is no sense in sitting removed from the reality and not understanding the day-to-day workings of teams, whether it is the technical teams or in the case of the business guys, the actual operational function of the business. If we do not sit with those teams, we have no idea what the reality is. And as an architect, your involvement in any project, in any piece of work does not end when you have done a design or an architectural decision or an architectural document. Our involvement in projects is a continuous involvement. It is not a discrete piece of work that we do, that we pass off to our development teams and then wash our hands of it. And then when they fail, that we, look at them and say, but this is not the architecture that I've designed. And the last one for me really is be a nice person. You don't know it all, so be open to listen. Be open to learn from others. Just don't be a know-it-all. We can't know everything. We learn from others, and especially in environments where things are quickly changing, people come with different ideas, different insights. It is absolutely vital that we are humble in our approach to projects, and that we are open to learning, and that a learning environment exists as an architect. So have a learning outlook on life as an architect, and you shall go far. So very quickly, the skills needed as an architect for me, this is a couple that I've listed and that I find is very much something that has stood me in good stead over the years. Be key skilled, mile wide, inch deep. So as an architect, know as much as possible about all the different domains, but specialize in something where you can focus and delve so deeply into it that you are an expert in it. The next one, really, the art of simplification. Often we as architects tend to try and complicate things to show in what value we bring. But I find that the value lies in the simplification of our problem spaces and the simplification of our solutions. This is a very fine balance between oversimplification and overcomplication. And finding that balance is really the art of simplification. They say that simplifying things is the most difficult thing to do. And it is really truly one of those things. It is an oxymoron in the sense that when in trying to do the simplification process, it's really, really complex. Then understanding the difference between best practice and best fit. And this changes from area to area in your context that you're working in. But you start off as a basis with best practice. But best practice does not necessarily mean best fit. Something that works in Europe may not work in South Africa, given our circumstances. Something that works in South Africa may not work elsewhere on the continent, given the differences. As an example, one of our local banks has expanded into the rest of Africa, and they underwent a process where they went and they changed the branches, and as part of that change, they introduced the screen that is between the teller and the customer. And we've seen that those screens have disappeared over the last year or so. And what they found is that in the rest of the continent, that their visit by customers to the branches dropped significantly. And they couldn't understand why, because they modernized the branches. It looked better. It had customer centricity at its heart. And upon investigation, what they found is really that before those screens didn't exist. And with the introduction of those screens, customers felt as if the cashiers and the service consultant suddenly created this barrier between customer and service consultant, and those eventually disappeared. So we need to understand best practice versus best fit. Once again, the art of documentation, very important. Document everything. Not just document it, but document it well so that it's easy enough to understand. The one thing that people might find as a sort of weird skill set to have, it's a skill set of marketing. We as architects also need to be marketers and learn how to sell, because you need to convince, on the one hand, your dev team that you've made the right decision and they need to buy into the architecture. And on the other hand, you need to convince the business people and the C-suite to invest money into a architecture that you have proposed. So marketing yourself, learning to sell yourself is a very important skill set to have, learning to sell the product that you have to offer. Project management skill set, very important. As an architect, often you will be asked to estimate and evaluate your proposed solution in terms of resource management, in terms of budgeting, in terms of cost analysis. So understanding the basic principles of project management, very important. As an architect, we need to be able to listen, right? Really, really listen and take in various input and formulate a solution that addresses people's concerns. Be a mentor or a coach. Once again, this is a personal thing, but I think it's something that all architects and all senior people should have, is that we are there to uplift our, our teams. We take them on the journey with us, but at the end of the day, if they are not learning, if we are not enabling a learning environment, we have failed. As senior leaders, as technologists, we have failed our teams. The last one, obviously, is something that sort of speaks to itself, and that's the skill of analytical thinking. You need to be able to analyze and compare various solutions. You need to be able to look at what it is that you are offering, what is in the market. Does it fit in with the company? How does it fit in with the organization? Does it fit in with the strategy? So from a architect perspective, analytical thinking is a fundamental skill that is needed. And very lastly, I just want to share a couple of observations on my 20 years as I've grown in the industry. The first one is the source code is your real architecture. It is not the document that the architect has created. It is really what is in place. If you are a business architect, it is not the business process that you have designed, but it's what your employees are doing on a day-to-day basis. If the employees or the code differs from the architecture as it is on paper, your architecture is outdated. And if they are vastly different, there should be a reason, and as an architect, you need to investigate what that reason is, and either change your architecture or change the ways of work, but you need to address, there's definitely an issue there. The second observation is that real architecture is an ever-evolving thing. Every day, as people work with your product, as developers program new things, as your business operators and employees go out and do their day-to-day business, and they find through shortcuts to doing business processes, or they skip certain steps in a business process, the architecture is evolving. And we as architects need to be so close to this that we either amend our process and our architecture, or we become stricter on what is allowed in the business process. The architecture definitely needs to be grown every day by acts of master of employees. Masterful employees, masterful programmers will determine your architecture, and every single one of them is an architect in his own right. because they ultimately, whatever they do, ultimately decides whether or not your architecture should be shelved, or if your architecture grows and changes, whatever they do is it something that impacts it. The fourth observation is that if you're an architect and you're not involved in the day-to-day operational work, you're out of touch with reality. And this can be very negatively impact the way you design and architect solutions, because you don't understand your business, you don't understand your tech stack, that you create pie in the sky architecture. You create blueprints that is in no way a true reflection of the day-to-day experience of the employees and or your software developers. And the last one for me is ultimately something that I share with everyone that I meet, is that everyone is some kind of architect. Whether you want to be or not, what you do on a day-to-day basis, if you're a PA and you're doing business requirements, do you think about the impact on your end user? If the business requirement is something as we would like to exclude users that earn less than X amount from accessing the specific thing or the specific type of loan if you're in the financial industry, what does that mean? Is there a social impact that is unintended? Does that mean we excluding a large section of the population that is of a specific race group? If you're looking in the financial sector, basing home loans on an area, what does that mean? So I think we also need to start thinking as IT professionals in the sense of our ethics and morality in terms of what we do on a day-to-day basis, and how the decisions and rules that we implement and decide on has a broader impact than just the project at hand. So lastly, before I close off, I just want to reword my initial statement. It should not be architects should fall. It is ivory tower architects must fall. And really what we need is to have architects that are in the trenches with people, sharing the day-to-day pains, sharing the day-to-day joys, and leading from the front through example, through mentorship, through coaching. And I just want to share this with you. From those of you that have watched the movie Ratatouille, Anton says at some point, not everyone can become a great artist, but a great artist can come from everywhere or anywhere. So too, not everyone can become an architect, but a great architect can come from anywhere. So from my advice and my encouragement to you is really look at the path of architects, not necessarily technical. We do have the business architects, and look at that as a potential for your career. How do we shape our businesses? How do we shape our country to be the best that it can be? Thank you. I shall stop sharing my screen at this point. Let's bring the video back.
Thank you so much, Marco. Now I'm going to hand over to my colleagues, and Disi and Tepu, who will just take you through the questions.
All right, thank you, Marco. Thank you, Lesego. We have a few questions on our chat. The first question is from Tepo, and it says, what is the role of the architect in digital transformation?
So the architect really, as I said, digital transformation can't happen without architects. The role of the architect really is to understand where the organization is currently, plan the roadmap, plan the necessary milestones, and get them to an endpoint where a digital transformed organization emerges at the end. So it talks to all those things about taking into consideration current business process, taking into consideration current resources, taking into consideration where the organization wants to be, taking into consideration the industry and the competitive nature of that industry, who your competitors are, You also don't want to do digital transformation for the sake of doing digital transformation. I think, personally, I think that digital transformation strategies will be as, what's the right word I'm looking for? Be as redundant as saying you have a power supply strategy. We need to do digital transformation. The architect will be ultimately the driver in that transformation, but it is not a single architecture domain that will drive it. I think it will be driven by all of the aforementioned domains. So the business architect, the data architect, enterprise architects, all of them will come together and have to come together to drive the transformation process. Thank you.
Okay, thank you,
Cool.
Marco.
Thank you so much, Marco. There's another question from Marshall. He says, why is it difficult to transition to an EA role from a business analyst or system analyst role when you're working in the same space which shares the same concerns and techniques?
So I find the transition into the enterprise architect role is hindered mostly by the other set of skills. So it's not the technical skill set that hinders the transition. I find people that move into the EA role also start engaging and looking at things like the business aspect of it, the software skills, the people management. I see people that transition successfully into that role, really going onto some sort of MBA or similar course, and really learning about the business aspect. The EA role is a very much a hybrid role. It is a technical role, but it is also a business role. And I think the transition really is hindered by a lot of us techies, and I include, the BAs and the testers in that statement, do not go and learn the soft skills. We do not learn the business skills. We do not learn the management skills. And sooner or later, we're going to hit that ceiling because we don't have the necessary skill sets. So yes, we work on the same concerns and techniques, but as an EA, you should also be able to walk and go speak to a CEO. So it is that gap that really hinders the transition. So Marshall, we need to start looking at the business side, understanding the business and business management, and bringing that into to complement your technical skills. Thanks. I hope that answers your questions, Mas.
Marco, there's another question here from Lizel. It says, starts off with a statement, and it says, I'm not interested in becoming an architect, but how can I best equip myself to work with architects as an IT business analyst?
So even though you don't want to become an architect, I think you need to start engaging with architects by sharing the same mindset as architects. The thing is, we need to look at the broader picture as architects. We need to understand the landscape a lot more broader than just a BA who is specifically looking at a project. So as a BA, I think what you need to start looking at is, how does the work I'm doing integrate into the rest of the organization in the context that I'm working in? How does that impact anything else? And when you speak to architects and you engage with them, you start talking about the broader impact, what you've discovered and what you see, the sort of integration points, potential collision points of conflict. So instead of just looking at, this is my requirement for the system and I need my devs to get this done, like I'm going to go speak to the architect to make them do it, your approach should be a little bit more different and a bit more broader than just my project and what I need done, but start looking at the bigger picture. So it is all about big picture thinking when we engage with architects. And the picture becomes bigger the higher up we go. So from the application architect all the way to the EA, they all have big picture thinking. It's just the size of the picture changes. So that would be my advice to you, Lisa. Start looking at the bigger picture, and when you engage, you bring in all those other things. It does give the architect the sense that you are not just looking at your project or the piece of work that you're looking at, but you have considered everything else, and it makes the conversations a lot easier.
Cool. Marshall comes back again and asks, how prevalent is the use of A patterns in real practice? Because I find that specification and classification redundant, if not completely useless.
Marshall, that is on the point that I said, as an architect, you need to understand the difference between best practice and best fit, right? A patterns really is best practice, but is it best fit? So I think you are very specific in this question because it is an environment that you've encountered them in. So for your environment, they are not best fit. It is one of those sort of things that you really, really need to apply your mind to. Best practice is not always the right thing. You know, gold standards is something that I hate the term gold standard, best practice, industry standard, or whatever you want to call it, because it's not applicable to every situation. And best fit is the right thing. So how prevalent is it? Prevalent enough for people to consider it a best practice, but not necessarily a best fit for your given organization in your given circumstances.
Leanne has a question and she's asking, what about having multiple people sitting in an architecture forum without a single owner? And she's also asking, what are the advantages or disadvantages?
Without a single owner, I'm assuming you're talking about a single architectural owner. So the way things should be structured, and it should be, and it's not often now it is that your enterprise architect should report to a chief enterprise architect or senior enterprise architect, and that person would then be the owner. When we talk about multiple people sitting on architecture forums, it is often better. As I said, you can have people from different domains sitting on that forum and giving insights into solutions. Because of the fact that architects generally have the T-shaped sort of knowledge, and often you may have missed something that impacts one of the other domains. So really it is a sense of as many people without it becoming as cumbersome. So hopefully a representative that's knowledgeable enough from each of the domains should be on your forum. It should also include a business person, so that you have an understanding of business strategy. But your business architect, in the absence of that business person, should be able to steer you in the right way. The absence of an owner, that is a bit concerning. There should be a chief architect that always looks after these and should be ultimately be accountable for all of these artifacts and the architectural decisions that are being made. Thank you.
Cool. Marshall comes back again, obviously very happy to engage you. He says, should architects be involved in approving the operational decisions of developers? Because an architect should focus on how the system is built and the definition of the building blocks and how those interact to fulfill a topical mandate. I find that like a duplication of effort if it's not blatant and undesired interference.
So yes, the architect should be involved in the approving of operational decisions of developers. It is the ambit of the application architect, which is very specifically and very detailed focus. And they generally only focus on a single, maybe a couple of applications depending, but they are very, very much a detailed oriented architect. So they will decide on operational decisions. They will decide on the type of tech stack that is used as long as it's in line with the broader architectural frameworks. They will decide on code changes and third-party libraries, etc. So the answer is definitely the architect should make those sort of decisions. The problem with that we find is that architects are often too far removed from the dev team. So an application architect should actually be part of the dev team They are not a separate entity. They're not sitting on the 10th floor drinking coffee while the devs are in the trenches deving 18-hour days. They should be part of the team, and they will make those decisions, and they should have the authority to make those decisions. So you shouldn't still have to go to a enterprise architect or a solution architect unless it impacts multiple systems, or it fundamentally has an impact on the enterprise architecture. So I think, Marshall, just to answer your question, is that the way the team should be is that your architect should effectively be part of your team. They should be part of the platoon. They should be part of the squad, whatever you call them in your various organizations, but the architect should be there. And their primary role is to make those decisions and remove the burden off the development team. And let the devs focus on implementation and getting the solution out.
The next question, Marco, is also around the involvement of the architect with the development. So this is from Henriette, and asking if the architects should be involved in code review.
Absolutely. It is part and parcel of the application architect's role. The reason being is that they must ensure that the coding standards that are set out in your architectural frameworks is adhered to, and that the architecture is as close to what the code is, or the code is as close to what the architecture is. So they should absolutely be part of your code review.
Okay, so Heaney asks, what type of tools does a typical architect use? Similar to a BA?
So I'm not too sure about the question in terms of tools, as in software tools or something else, but there are multiple software tools that is used. Obviously, the primary thing being underpinned by the use of UML and the likes, but enterprise architecture as a tool. There are multiple tools for diagramming and visualization of your architecture. And then obviously for your investigation and analysis work, it's similar to what the BA would use. But I firmly believe that your architect should also be a developer, so they should also be using the dev tools. So to answer your question, any tool that a developer or BA should use or does use is what an architect should have access to and should be able to use with comfort.
The next question is from Marshall, and it is, what conversations do you employ in executing and representing architectures? He says, I see Archimedes is pushed to the industry, but I feel that it's an overkill that shouldn't be employed as a standard for modeling. What do you think?
So Archimedes is just one of the many tools. Enterprise Architect is another. It is just a tool. I don't think it's being pushed to the industry. I think it's pushed in certain companies, and depending. Companies use Microsoft Visio to do architectural design work. So it is, the conventions use is UML, and any of the tools that support UML is an acceptable tool. It is, I think, the fact that you're looking at Archimedes is really just the exposure that you've had. But I've worked with Archimedes, I've worked with Enterprise Architect, I've worked with Microsoft Visio. So it really is a part and parcel of the decision-making of the architects in that specific company on the tool sets. It is similar to when they define as a development team that everyone uses IntelliJ or everyone uses Visual Studio and everyone uses a specific set of standards for dev. So it is a very similar, it's a decision that is made. It's not necessarily a tool that's pushed by the industry, but I think it's one of the top tools to be used.
All right. We have a question here from Musa who asks, as a startup company, where should one start when developing a small solution, but want to have a solid architecture for the solution?
As a startup, and you want to design.
As a startup company, sorry,
Yeah.
did you hear? You had the question.
The question is, as a startup, where should you start designing your architecture
Yes.
to have a solid foundation?
Yeah.
It's a brilliant question. You can't escape architecture. So in the question of that Marcel asked about Archimedes, if you have access to PowerPoint, just draw the blocks on how you think things fit together. Identify your integration points. Draw the architecture that you have in mind to support your product. Go through the process. You don't necessarily need to use the tools that are used by the more established corporates and the likes. You can use literally anything that you have access to, whether it's PowerPoint or Microsoft Visio, which I know is a bit expensive, but draw the architecture that you think fits in and support your product and what you're trying to get there. Go through an iteration of developing it. Go back to the drawing board. Go through an iteration. Think about your architecture as an evolving thing. Go through a number of iterations to get the right architecture. It's going to be very difficult for you to create a perfect architecture from the get-go. I would think that the best approach is to create an evolutionary architecture. Take a piece of the product that you're comfortable with and create the architecture that you want to support that piece of the product, and then just evolve it into a final architecture that is never going to be final, because we are agile and we are responding, especially at the startup. You will respond to customer needs and feedback. You will respond to the environment that you're planning on competing in, your direct and indirect competitors, changes in the regulation potentially, government, etc., the rest of the world going forward. So start off with a piece of the architecture, get it on paper, see if it works. If it doesn't work, go back, rework it, and continue doing it that way. Do as little design up front as possible, with the idea that it never ceases. And I think that's going to be the base as a startup. Don't spend too much time on the architecture and the design work, but don't forgo it completely.
And then the last question on the chat, it's from Diman, and it says, don't you think that because architecture is so often owned by an architect or the CIO, that the business then discounts it as being a technology thing? So the question is, or the thinking around this is, because the CEO or business owner should actually own the architecture, since it ultimately enables the business to function and to achieve its business goals.
So I'm just reading the question and trying to make sense of it. That's the problem with technology as a whole, I think, is that often it is seen not as a business enabler, but as something that happens on the side that IT runs. So I agree with you that it could lead to the business owner, the CEO, thinking that, you know, it's really just a technology thing, or even the business. This is a symptom of not structuring your organization correctly. It is, if we all understand the role that the various components and departments within our business plays, it becomes a lot easier. Architecture is not something that is dreamt up by some. That's why I talked about the ivory tower architecture. That was the way things are in the past, and in some companies it's still the way it is. But really, an architect should be as close to the business as possible. And then when you start looking at people with the title of chief enterprise architect or just enterprise architect, these are the guys that would sit in the same sort of fora as the CIO, the CEO, the CFO, and they would have these discussions, and they are part of the strategic planning for their business. And one of the outcomes of your implementation of your strategic plan for whatever period that you've planned for is the architecture and how that supports the business. So I think we need to also start looking at how do we bring our architecture out of the ivory towers and into the business. But I think it's a broader conversation about seeing IT as a business enabler and on the same level as anyone else in the business, and not just a sort of the red-headed stepchild that we need because we can't do business without computers type thing. So definitely the architecture guys and the senior architects need to be in the same room as the CIO, the CEO, and the likes, the CFO, when the strategic meetings happen, part of the board meetings when needed. So it's a collective decision that is driven by or executed by the architects.
All right, thank you so much again, Marco. I think, because of time, we won't be going through all of the questions, but we will be sending through all the questions to you, and hopefully you'll be able to reply, especially the questions that we've not gotten to reach to them in the chats. And you know what, and thank you for also, coming through and telling us and taking us through this session of, what is the role of an architect in the modern enterprise. And just before we wrap up, I would just like to inform people that the recording will be available on our YouTube channel on IIBASA, where you will find the recording of today's session. And if you want to also be part of this community, you can also then, join through our website, which is the IIBA website as well. And thank you so much again, everybody who has joined this session, and have a good evening.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for having me. It has been a pleasure coming here and doing this presentation.
Yeah.
Definitely we'll answer the questions as they come through.
Okay.
Hopefully we'll get through all of it.
Thank you so much, man. Yeah, we really enjoyed it. I think for a topic which is not really up our alley, the questions were quite interesting, and I think if we had more time, we definitely wanted you to answer all of them because people are really excited about the topic.
Yeah.